I never thought I'd be calculating the exact dollar value of a marriage at 67 years old. The morning Arthur left, I was reorganizing our bookstore's poetry section when he walked in with 2 suitcases, and that look I'd seen before when he was about to disappoint me. "Odette, I need my freedom," he said, as if 40 years of marriage had been a prison sentence. He took his clothes, his guitar, and apparently our entire savings account. But what would it cost him to walk away from everything I'd built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after Arthur left, I sat in our kitchen staring at his wedding ring on the counter. He'd placed it there deliberately, right next to the ceramic bowl I'd made in a pottery class he'd mocked 20 years ago. The house felt different without his presence. Not emptier exactly, but cleaner somehow. Like the air itself had been, holding its breath. I made coffee the way I liked it, strong and black, without the cream Arthur always insisted on. For 40 years I'd bought cream I didn't want, stored it in a refrigerator I'd paid for, in a house I'd maintained. The coffee tasted like possibility. Our home in Dorset Hollow had been my sanctuary, long before Arthur appreciated it. I'd found this Victorian cottage in 1983, when we were newlyweds, and broke. Arthur had wanted something modern, something that didn't require work. But I'd seen past the peeling paint and sagging porch to the bones of something beautiful. I'd scraped and painted every inch of trim myself while pregnant with Rhea, our eldest. Arthur had been too busy with his music to help. The house sat on Maple Street, 3 blocks from the harbor where fishing boats still bobbed in the early morning mist. From my kitchen window I could see the weathered shingles of the coastal bookshelf, the store that had consumed our lives for the past 15 years. Arthur had called it his dream, but I'd been the one balancing the books, ordering inventory, and staying late to clean up after his poetry readings that rarely sold more than a dozen books. I pulled out my life ledger, a leather-bound journal my therapist had suggested I start 5 years ago, when Arthur's midlife crisis first began manifesting as expensive guitar equipment and younger women's phone numbers left carelessly in his pockets. Dr. Hennigan had called it a place to process my feelings, but it had become something else entirely, a meticulous record of contributions, sacrifices, and investments, both financial and emotional. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. Paid $247 for Arthur's Martin guitar. He promised to contribute to household expenses with his music income. Total earned to date, $0. Flipping through the pages, I found dozens of similar entries. The roof repair I'd funded with my teacher's retirement savings. The bookstore renovation I'd project managed, while Arthur attended a writer's retreat in Vermont. The family vacations I'd planned and paid for, while he complained about being too stressed to enjoy them. My phone buzzed with a text from Rhea, my elder daughter. "Mom, are you okay? Dad called and said you two are separating. I'm driving up from Chicago tonight." I stared at the message, imagining Arthur's version of events. Probably something about growing apart, needing space, the natural evolution of a marriage. He was gifted at making his selfishness sound philosophical. Before I could respond, another text arrived from Maisie, my younger daughter in Vermont. "Dad says you're handling this well. Should I be worried that you're handling this too well?" Maisie knew me better than Arthur ever had. She'd inherited my intuition along with my stubborn streak, and she could read between the lines of family politeness better than anyone. I texted them both. "Come for dinner Sunday. I'll explain everything then." The truth was, I felt calmer than I had in years. Arthur's departure had removed a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For decades, I'd shaped my days around his moods, his needs, his creative schedule. I'd retired early from teaching to support his bookstore dream, then worked twice as hard to make it profitable when his romantic vision collided with economic reality. I walked through our house, seeing it with new eyes. The built-in bookshelves I'd designed and hired someone to install. The hardwood floors I'd refinished myself, one room at a time. The garden I'd planted and maintained, where Arthur occasionally read but never weeded. Every improvement, every repair, every decision that had turned this house into a home had been mine. In the living room, I opened the secretary desk where we kept important papers. Arthur had always handled the finances, or so I'd thought. Now, I needed to understand exactly what he'd left me with. The mortgage papers were filed neatly in a folder marked House Stuff in my handwriting. The deed was there too, and as I read it carefully for the first time in years, something interesting caught my attention. The house was in my name only. I'd forgotten this detail from our purchase 37 years ago. Arthur's credit had been terrible then, destroyed by student loans he'd defaulted on, and credit cards he'd maxed out on recording equipment. I'd been the teacher with steady income and responsible financial history. The mortgage company had required the deed to be in my name alone. Arthur had been living in my house. I made a fresh pot of coffee and called my friend Lou Harper, who'd been my closest confidant since we'd taught at Dorset High together. Lou had retired from her accounting practice 5 years ago and spent her time volunteering at the animal shelter and dispensing unsolicited but usually accurate financial advice. "Odette, honey, I've been waiting for your call," Lou said before I could speak. "Arthur stopped by yesterday to ask about cashing out his teacher's pension early. I told him he'd have to talk to you since you're listed as the beneficiary." This was news to me. "What pension? He only taught for 2 years before he quit." "Exactly. It's not much, maybe $8,000, but it's something. The man has no idea how money works. He seemed shocked that he couldn't just walk into the credit union and withdraw it." I felt something stirring in my chest. Not anger exactly, but a sharp clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Arthur had walked away from our marriage assuming he could take whatever he wanted, while leaving me with whatever he didn't. But he'd miscalculated badly. "Lou, I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. You know I don't know any other kind, sweetheart. From an accounting perspective, if I wanted to determine exactly what Arthur owes me, where would I start?" Lou was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into professional mode. "Well, that's an interesting question. Are we talking about a formal asset division, or are we talking about something more creative? I'm not sure yet, but I keep thinking about all the money I put into his dreams, all the opportunities I gave up to support his choices. If this were a business partnership being dissolved, what would I be entitled to? Everything," Lou said without hesitation. "Based on what I've seen over the years, you've been the primary investor, manager, and unpaid employee of Arthur Albridge Enterprises. If I were auditing your marriage, I'd say he owes you significantly more than he could ever repay." After we hung up, I returned to my life ledger and began making lists. Not the therapeutic kind Dr. Hennigan had encouraged, but methodical inventories with dates, amounts, and documentation. I had receipts for most major purchases, bank statements going back years, and a memory for detail that Arthur had always found annoying. By evening, I had filled 12 pages with entries. 984. Delayed graduate school to support Arthur's music career. Estimated lost earnings from advanced degree, $15,000 annually, X 30 years, LAR 450 in 1987. Used inheritance from grandmother to pay Arthur's tax debt. 8,000, 5,000 or 199.95. Took second job tutoring to pay for family vacation. Arthur wanted to take to inspire his songwriting. $32,000 and $2,003. Paid for Arthur's share of Ria's college tuition when he spent education savings on recording studio time. 18,000. The numbers were staggering. Over 4 decades, I had subsidized Arthur's life to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars, not counting the intangible costs of emotional labor, domestic work, and career sacrifices. My phone rang around 9 o'clock. Arthur's number appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. But curiosity won. "Odette, we need to talk about practical matters," he said, his voice carrying that reasonable tone he used when he wanted something. "I'll need access to the house to get the rest of my things, and we should discuss how to handle the bookstore." "Of course," I said pleasantly. "When would be convenient for you?" "Tomorrow morning. I'm staying at Gary's place, but it's temporary. I'll need to figure out a more permanent situation." Gary was Arthur's bandmate from 30 years ago, a man who'd never married and lived in a studio apartment above the hardware store. I almost felt sorry for both of them. "Arthur, before you come by, I have a question. When you took money from our accounts, how much did you leave for household expenses?" "I only took what I needed for the security deposit and first month's rent on a new place. There should be plenty left. But I'd already checked. Our joint checking account had a balance of 240 svathers. Our savings account, where I'd been building a nest egg from my Social Security payments, was completely empty." "I see," I said. "And the bookstore accounts?" "Those are complicated. We'll need to figure out how to split the business assets." Arthur had no idea that I'd been maintaining separate records of the bookstore's finances, tracking every dollar I'd invested versus his contributions. He also didn't know that I'd been the one signing the lease renewals for the past 5 years, or that the business licenses were in my name. "You're right. It is complicated," I agreed. "I've been reviewing our financial records tonight, and there are some interesting discrepancies I'd like to discuss." "Discrepancies?" "Oh, just some questions about contributions and investments over the years. Nothing that can't be sorted out. Will 10 o'clock work for you tomorrow?" After I hung up, I sat in the quiet house feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades: anticipation. For 40 years I'd been reactive, accommodating, flexible. I'd bent my life around Arthur's dreams and called it love. But Arthur had made a crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed that leaving me would be as simple as walking away. He was about to learn that some debts compound interest over time. The fog was rolling in from the harbor, wrapping around the street lamps like gauze. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and returned to my life ledger. There were still so many entries to catalog, so many forgotten sacrifices to quantify. Tomorrow, Arthur would discover that I'd been keeping receipts all along. The next morning, I woke before dawn and spent an hour in my garden, pulling weeds and deadheading the roses I'd planted 15 years ago. Arthur had always complained that gardening was a waste of time, that we should hire someone or let the yard go natural. But I'd persisted, and now the garden was a testament to patient, consistent care. Arthur arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, looking younger than his 69 years in new jeans and a flannel shirt I didn't recognize. He'd always been handsome, in an aging folk singer way, with silver hair that curled just slightly and eyes the color of sea glass. Looking at him now, I felt nothing beyond mild curiosity about his plans. "You look good, Odette," he said, hovering near the kitchen island, where his wedding ring still sat. "This situation doesn't have to be ugly." I couldn't agree more. I replied, gesturing for him to sit. "Coffee?" "Please." I poured him a cup with cream, exactly the way he liked it, and set my life ledger on the table between us. "What's that?" he asked. "A record of our financial partnership over the past 40 years. I thought it might be helpful as we figure out how to dissolve things fairly." Arthur's expression shifted slightly. "Odette, I hope you're not going to make this difficult. We both contributed to this marriage in different ways." "Absolutely. I'm all about fair contribution." I opened the ledger to the first page. "For instance, I contributed the down payment for this house in 1984. $22,000 from my teaching savings. What was your contribution to that purchase?" Well, I provided emotional support during the stressful buying process." "Right. And the value of emotional support in 1984 dollars was what, exactly?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "You can't quantify a marriage like a business transaction." "You're absolutely right. Marriage involves so much more than money." I flipped to a page filled with entries about childcare, household management, and social obligations. "It also involves labor. For example, who arranged play dates for the girls, who handled teacher conferences, who planned birthday parties and family gatherings." "You enjoyed doing those things. Did I? Or did I do them because someone had to, and you were always too busy with your music?" I could see Arthur calculating, trying to figure out where this conversation was leading. He'd never been comfortable with direct confrontation, preferring to let issues fade away rather than address them head-on. "Look, Odette, I know you're hurt, and you have every right to be. But we're both adults. We can figure out a way to split things that's fair to everyone. I'm so glad you feel that way." I turned to a page I'd prepared specifically for this conversation, because I've done some preliminary calculations about fair division of assets, and I think you're going to find them very reasonable. Arthur leaned forward to look at the page, and his face went pale. "According to my records, over the course of our marriage, you owe me approximately $437,000 in direct financial contributions, not including interest or opportunity costs." "That's ridiculous." "Is it? Let's start with something simple. The bookstore renovation in 2018. I paid the contractor $18,000 out of my retirement savings. What did you contribute?" "I supervised the work." "For how many hours?" "Don't know. Maybe 20 hours total." "So you valued your supervision at $900 per hour." Arthur stood up abruptly. "This is insane, Odette. You're talking about our life together like it was some kind of business contract. You're the one who broke the contract, Arthur. I'm just figuring out what you owe me in severance." "I don't owe you anything. We built this life together." "Did we?" I flipped through several pages of entries. "Because, according to my records, I built this life while you lived in it. There's a difference." Arthur began pacing around the kitchen, running his hands through his hair the way he always did when he felt cornered. "You can't seriously expect me to pay you $400,000. "Of course not. You don't have $400,000. I closed the ledger and looked at him directly. "But you do have assets we can liquidate." "What assets?" "Well, there's your guitar collection, your amplifiers, your share of the bookstore inventory, your car. Those things aren't worth anywhere near $400,000. "No, they're not, which is why I've prepared an alternative settlement proposal." I slid a folder across the table. Arthur opened it with trembling hands. "You want me to sign over my share of the bookstore?" I want you to acknowledge that your share of the bookstore doesn't actually exist. I've been the primary investor, manager, and worker for 15 years. You've been a part-time employee at best. That's not true, isn't it? When did you last balance the books, order inventory, handle a difficult customer, plan an event? Arthur was quiet for a long moment. I provided the creative vision, and I provided everything else. The question is, what's creative vision worth without execution? I could see him trying to find a way out of this conversation, looking for the exit ramp that would let him maintain his self-image as the wronged party seeking freedom from an oppressive marriage. Odette, I can't give you the bookstore. It's my life's work. No, Arthur. It's my life's work. You just performed in it occasionally. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock I'd inherited from my mother. Arthur sat back down, staring at the papers in front of him. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to sign a document acknowledging that I am the sole owner of the coastal bookshelf, that you have no claim to this house or any of the assets I purchased and maintained, and that you will remove your belongings by the end of the week. And if I don't sign, then I'll file for divorce and request a full forensic accounting of our finances. I'll ask for spousal support based on 40 years of unpaid domestic labor. I'll claim damages for career opportunities I gave up to support your dreams. And I'll make sure everyone in Dorset Hollow understands exactly why our marriage ended. Arthur's face had gone from pale to gray. You're blackmailing me. I'm offering you a choice. You can leave quietly with your guitar and your dignity intact, or you can fight me and discover exactly how much documentation I have about our financial partnership. This isn't you, Odette. You're not vindictive. You're right. I'm not vindictive. I'm practical. And after 40 years of subsidizing your dreams, I'm done being generous. Arthur stared at the papers for several minutes. Finally, he picked up a pen. I need time to think about this. Of course. Take all the time you need. But I should mention that I've already changed the locks, and I've notified the bank that you no longer have authorization to access any accounts with my name on them. You changed the locks? It's my house, Arthur. I can change the locks whenever I want. He signed the papers with sharp, angry strokes, then pushed them back across the table. I'll get my things this afternoon. I'll leave boxes on the front porch. Take only what's yours. After Arthur left, I sat in my kitchen feeling oddly deflated. For months, I'd been building toward this confrontation, imagining it would feel more dramatic, more satisfying. Instead, it felt like completing a long-overdue administrative task. I called Lou to let her know what had happened. How do you feel? She asked. Tired, but also relieved. Like I've been holding my breath for 40 years and finally exhaled. What's next? I looked around my kitchen, seeing it fresh again. I think I'm going to redecorate. That afternoon, I watched from my bedroom window as Arthur loaded boxes into his car. He moved slowly like a man in physical pain, stopping frequently to stare at objects I couldn't see from my vantage point. Part of me felt sorry for him, but it was a distant sort of sympathy, the kind you might feel for a stranger experiencing misfortune. When he was finished, he stood on the front walkway for several minutes, looking back at the house. Then he got in his car and drove away. I waited until his taillights disappeared before going downstairs to collect his wedding ring from the kitchen counter. It was heavier than I remembered, solid gold with an inscription that read, Forever O&A 1984. Forever had lasted exactly 39 years and 8 months. I dropped the ring into the small ceramic bowl I'd made in pottery class, where it landed with a satisfying clink. Then I opened my life ledger to a fresh page and wrote, Day 1, house reclaimed, business secured, marriage dissolved, cost to date, 1 gold wedding ring, value approximately $200, net savings, everything else. The sun was setting over Dorset Hollow, painting the harbor in shades of amber and rose. From my kitchen window, I could see the coastal bookshelf, dark now but full of possibility. Tomorrow I would start the real work of rebuilding not just the business, but myself. For the first time in decades, I had no one's dreams to support but my own. 3 days after Arthur moved out, my daughters arrived for the dinner I'd promised them. Rhea came straight from her architectural firm in Chicago, still wearing her power suit and carrying the leather briefcase that had been my gift to her when she made partner. Maisie drove down from Vermont in her paint-splattered Subaru, with her 3-year-old son, Finn, asleep in his car seat. I'd spent the morning cooking their favorite meal, the same roast chicken and herb stuffing I'd made for every important family gathering since they were children. The dining room table was set with my grandmother's china, the good plates I'd only used for holidays when Arthur complained about the extra dishes to wash. Mom, you look different, Maisie said, studying my face as she settled Finn in his booster seat. Younger somehow. I got my hair cut, I replied, though that wasn't really what she meant. I had stopped by Clara's salon on Main Street and asked her to take off 6 inches of the gray hair I'd been growing long because Arthur preferred it that way. The result was a chin-length bob that felt impossibly light. Rhea was examining the papers Arthur had signed, her lawyer's mind working through the implications. Mom, this is remarkably thorough. Did you write this yourself? Lou helped with the legal language, but the financial analysis was all mine. Telling and preparing. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You could have taken him for a lot more, Rhea said approvingly. In a formal divorce proceeding, you'd be entitled to spousal support, especially given the career sacrifices you made. I don't want his money, I said, bringing the roast to the table. I just want what's mine. Maisie was looking uncomfortable, the way she always did when family conversations turned practical. She'd inherited Arthur's romantic streak, along with his discomfort with conflict. Are you sure this is what you want, Mom? 40 years is a long time to just walk away from. I'm not walking away from anything, sweetheart. I'm walking toward something new. But what if Dad wants to reconcile? What if this freedom thing is just a phase? Rhea snorted. Maisie, he cleaned out their bank accounts and moved in with his bandmate. This isn't a phase. It's an abandonment. Rhea, I said, gently, your sister is allowed to hope for the best in people. It's one of her better qualities. But privately, I agreed with Rhea's assessment. Arthur's departure had been too calculated, too thorough to be impulsive. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. Over dinner, I told them about my plans. For the bookstore, I wanted to expand the poetry section, add a small cafe area, and start hosting writing workshops. I'd already contacted 3 local authors about teaching classes, and I was considering renting out the upstairs storage space to a young woman who wanted to start a small literary press. That sounds wonderful, Mom, Maisie said, though I could hear the worry in her voice. But running a business alone is a lot of work. I've been running it alone for years. Now I just don't have to pretend Arthur is helping. Rhea laughed at this, but Maisie looked stricken. She'd always tried to see the best in her father, to find ways to excuse his selfishness as artistic temperament. Girls, I said carefully, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry at your father, and I don't want you to feel like you have to choose sides. But I also need you to see me as I actually am. Not as the accommodating wife and mother I've been pretending to be." "What do you mean?" Maisie asked. "I mean that for 40 years I shaped myself around other people's needs. I made myself smaller so everyone else could feel bigger. And I'm tired of being small." Rhea reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Good for you, Mom. It's about time." After dinner, while Maisie was putting Finn to bed in the guest room, Rhea and I sat on the front porch, drinking wine and watching the evening fog roll in from the harbor. "Can I ask you something?" Rhea said. "Did you see this coming? Your father leaving? Yes and no. I knew he was unhappy, but I thought it was the kind of general discontent that comes with aging. I didn't realize he was planning an escape. I meant, did you see yourself fighting back this way? A year ago, if someone had told me you'd change the locks and force Dad to sign over the business, I would have said they were crazy." I considered this. I think I've been preparing for this moment without realizing it. All those therapy sessions, all those years of keeping track of things in my journal. I was building a case without knowing it. Do you regret any of it? The marriage, I mean. I regret staying small for so long, but I don't regret having you and your sister. And I don't regret learning that I'm stronger than I thought. The next morning, Rhea left early to catch a flight back to Chicago, but Maisie stayed for breakfast. She seemed to have something on her mind, stirring her coffee absently, while Finn played with blocks on the kitchen floor. "Mom, can I tell you something?" "Of course. David and I have been having problems. David was Maisie's husband, a sweet but passive man who worked for the Vermont Department of Tourism. I'd always suspected that Maisie had married him, partly because he was the opposite of Arthur, steady and reliable but lacking in passion." "What kind of problems?" "He's been making big decisions without talking to me. Last month he took a job in Burlington without asking what I thought about moving. He just assumed I'd go along with it." "What did you tell him?" "That I needed time to think about it. But honestly, Mom, watching you stand up to Dad has made me realize how often I just go along with things to keep the peace." I reached across the table and took her hand. "What do you want to do?" "I want to tell David that if he wants to move to Burlington, he can go ahead. But Finn and I are staying in Montpelier until he learns to include us in major life decisions." "That sounds reasonable." "Does it? Because it feels terrifying. What if he just goes without us? Then you'll know where you stand, and you can make your decisions accordingly." Maisie was quiet for several minutes, watching Finn stack blocks into an elaborate tower. "Is it weird that watching you get divorced is making me want to save my marriage?" "Not weird at all. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose something to save it." After Maisie left, I walked down to the bookstore to begin the real work of transformation. The building was a converted sea captain's house from the 1890s, with wide plank floors and built-in shelves that Arthur had insisted gave the place character. I'd always thought it looked more cramped than charming, but I deferred to his vision. Now, walking through the space with fresh eyes, I could see its potential. The front room would be perfect for new releases and bestsellers. The middle room could house the poetry and literary fiction sections, and the back room would be ideal for a small cafe area with a few tables and comfortable chairs. I was making notes about furniture arrangements when the door chimed and a young woman entered. She was perhaps 30, with short dark hair and paint-stained fingers, carrying a messenger bag covered in literary pins. "Are you Odette Albridge?" she asked. "I am. I'm Mira Cho. I called yesterday about renting space upstairs. I'd forgotten about the appointment. In the chaos of Arthur's departure and my daughter's visit, many normal business concerns had slipped my mind. Of course. Let me show you around. The upstairs had been Arthur's domain, a cluttered office where he'd supposedly worked on his novel but mostly played guitar and browsed the internet. I'd cleared out his personal belongings, leaving behind only a desk, a filing cabinet, and boxes of old inventory. "This is perfect," Mira said, looking around the space with obvious excitement. "I could set up my computer here, use this area for manuscript storage, and maybe put a small couch there for meetings with authors. Tell me about your business." "I want to start a small press focused on poetry and experimental fiction. I have a master's degree in publishing from Emerson, and I've been working for a literary magazine in Boston for 5 years. But I want to create something more personal, more connected to community. Why Dorset Hollow? Because it's beautiful, because the rent is affordable, and because I think small towns need literary culture as much as cities do. Maybe more." I found myself liking Mira immediately. She had the kind of focused enthusiasm that reminded me of my younger self, before I'd learned to temper my dreams with practicality. "The rent is $400 a month, utilities included. Would that work for you?" "That would be perfect. When could I start?" "Whenever you want. I'll have Lou draw up a lease agreement." After Mira left, I stood in the empty upstairs office feeling energized in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The building, which had felt stagnant and tired during Arthur's tenure, was beginning to feel alive with possibility. I spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging the ground floor, moving poetry from its tiny corner shelf to a prominent display near the front window. I created a new section for local authors and set aside space for the writing workshop materials I planned to order. Around 5 o'clock, I was kneeling on the floor pricing books when the door chimed again. A man entered, tall and thin, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. I recognized him as one of our regular customers, though I'd never learned his name. "I'm sorry, are you still open?" he asked. "I can come back tomorrow if you're closing." "Not at all. What can I help you find?" I was looking for something new in poetry, something contemporary. I gestured toward my newly expanded poetry section. "I just reorganized this area. Is there a particular style you prefer?" He browsed the shelves thoughtfully, pulling out volumes by Mary Oliver, Billy Collins, and Ocean Vuong. "I'm not very knowledgeable about contemporary poetry, but I know what moves me." "Those are excellent choices. Are you looking for anything specific? Themes, emotions, particular life experiences?" "I suppose I'm looking for poems about transition, about starting over." Something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. "Are you going through a transition yourself?" "My wife died 2 years ago. I'm finally at the point where I'm trying to figure out what comes next." "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. It's strange how long it takes to feel ready to move forward, but I think I'm finally there." I selected a slim volume by a poet I'd discovered recently. "This might speak to you. She writes about loss and renewal with remarkable grace," he read. The back cover, then flipped through a few pages. "This looks perfect. Thank you for the recommendation." "You're welcome. I'm Odette, by the way. I don't think we've been properly introduced, though I've seen you in here many times." "Calder Finch. I'm a history professor at the community college. Well, I was. I retired last year." "What did you teach?" "American maritime history. Specifically, the merchant marine industry in Maine during the 19th century. That must have been fascinating. This area has such rich maritime heritage." "It does. I've been working on a book about the ship captains who built these houses along Main Street. Your bookstore building was actually owned by Captain Josiah Morse in the 1890s. I had no idea. That's wonderful. Are you planning to publish the book locally? I hadn't really thought about it. I suppose I assumed I'd need to find a university press or something similar. Well, I happen to know someone who's starting a small literary press right here in town. If you're interested, I could introduce you. Calder smiled, and I noticed that his eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that suggested someone who smiled often. That would be very kind of you. After he left with his book of poetry, I realized that I'd been flirting slightly, something I hadn't done in so long. I'd almost forgotten how. The realization didn't alarm me as much as it might have a week ago. I was a free woman now, able to appreciate attractive, intelligent men without guilt or complication. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it on the front porch while reading one of the poetry books I'd recommended. To Calder, the poems were indeed about transition, about the courage required to reinvent oneself after loss. One passage particularly struck me. At 65, I learned to swim, not because the water called to me, but because I tired of standing on the shore, watching others dive into depths I deemed too dangerous for someone like me. I closed the book and looked out at my garden, where the evening primroses were beginning to open in the twilight. For 40 years, I'd been standing on the shore of my own life, watching other people dive into adventures I'd convinced myself were too risky, too selfish, too impractical for a responsible wife and mother. But I wasn't a wife anymore. My children were grown. For the first time in decades, I had no one to consider but myself. The possibility was intoxicating. I pulled out my life ledger and turned to a fresh page. Instead of recording sacrifices and losses, I began making a different kind of list. Things I want to do now that I'm free. Travel to Ireland to see the places my grandmother described. Take a pottery class and make more than just bowls. Submit my poems to literary magazines. Learn to swim in the ocean. Have a conversation with an interesting man without worrying about Arthur's reaction. Paint my bedroom a color Arthur hated. Buy clothes that make me feel beautiful. Say no to things I don't want to do. Say yes to things that scare me. Live out loud. The list felt like a manifesto, a declaration of independence from the small, careful life I'd been living. I was 67 years old, healthy, financially secure, and completely free to reinvent myself. The question was, who did I want to become? Over the next several weeks, I threw myself into transforming both the bookstore and my life, with an energy that surprised everyone, including myself. I hired local contractors to install a small kitchen area in the back room of the store, complete with an espresso machine and display case for pastries I planned to source from the bakery down the street. Mira moved into the upstairs office and immediately began filling it with manuscripts, file folders, and an impressive collection of literary magazines. She worked with the kind of focused intensity I remembered from my own graduate school days, often staying late into the evening to research potential authors or design promotional materials. "You know," she said one afternoon as we shared coffee and discussed her latest acquisition, "I've never had a business partner before, but you're starting to feel like one. How so?" "You understand what I'm trying to do here. When I describe my vision for a community-centered literary press, you don't look at me like I'm naive or impractical. You look at me like you've had similar dreams." She was right. Watching Mira pursue her publishing dreams was awakening ambitions I'd set aside decades ago. In graduate school, I dreamed of starting a literary magazine, of creating a platform for voices that might otherwise go unheard. I'd abandoned that dream when I married Arthur and moved to Dorset Hollow, telling myself it was impractical, unrealistic. But what if it wasn't? Mira, can I ask you something? Would you be interested in collaborating on a literary magazine? Something quarterly, maybe, that could showcase local and regional writers? Her face lit up. Are you serious? That would be incredible. I have contacts with poets and fiction writers all over New England who would love to have a place to publish work that's too experimental for mainstream magazines. I'm completely serious. I have some savings I could invest, and we have the perfect space to work from. That evening I called Rhea to tell her about my new venture. "Mom, that sounds amazing," she said. "But are you sure you want to take on another business commitment so soon after the divorce?" "It doesn't feel like a commitment. It feels like coming home to myself. I'm happy for you. You sound more excited than I've heard you in years." The next day, Calder stopped by the store with a draft of the first chapter of his maritime history book. I'd introduced him to Mira the week before, and she'd expressed genuine interest in his project. "I'm not sure this is good enough for publication," he said, handing me a folder. "I'm used to writing academic papers, not popular history." I read the first few pages while he browsed the new releases section. His writing was clear and engaging, bringing the 19th century sea captains to life with vivid details and compelling anecdotes. "Calder, this is wonderful. You have a gift for making historical figures feel like real people." "Do you really think so?" "I know so. Mira's going to love this." As if summoned by her name, Mira appeared at the top of the stairs, laptop in hand. "Is that the ship captain manuscript? I've been dying to read it." Calder was just expressing some doubts about the quality, I said. "Academic writers always underestimate their ability to reach general audiences," Mira said, settling into one of the new cafe chairs. "They're so used to writing for other experts, they forget how interesting their work can be to regular readers." Calder looked pleased but still uncertain. "I appreciate your confidence, but I'm not sure I know how to write for a broader audience." "That's what editors are for," I said, "and Mira is an excellent editor." "Would you be willing to work with me on this?" Calder asked Mira. "I mean, professionally. I could pay you for editing services." "I'd love to, but I should warn you I'm going to push you to make it even more accessible and engaging than it already is." Watching their conversation, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with business success. I was bringing creative people together, fostering collaborations that might not have happened otherwise. The bookstore was becoming what I'd always imagined it could be, a genuine community hub for literary culture. Later that evening, after Mira had gone home and I'd closed the store, Calder lingered to help me stack chairs and wipe down tables. "Can I ask you something?" he said as we worked. "What happened to your husband? I used to see him here quite often, but I haven't noticed him recently." "We separated a few weeks ago. He decided he needed his freedom." "I'm sorry. That must have been difficult." "Actually, it's been liberating. I'm discovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed." Calder nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that feeling. After Margaret died, I spent almost 2 years just trying to get through each day. But eventually, I realized that grief had burned away a lot of the assumptions I'd been living with. I had to figure out who I was without her, and in some ways, that person was more authentic than who I'd been before." "How long were you married?" 32 years. We met in graduate school and built our whole adult lives together. When she died, I felt like I'd lost not just my wife, but my entire identity as a husband." What helped you move through that? Time, mostly, and books. I read everything I could find about loss and renewal. Poetry helped especially. There's something about the compressed language of poems that captures complex emotions better than prose. We finished cleaning in comfortable silence, then walked outside together. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. "Would you like to get dinner sometime?" Calder asked suddenly. "I mean, as friends. I know you're going through your own transition, and I don't want to complicate that. But I enjoy talking with you, and I thought you might enjoy a break from cooking for yourself." I considered the invitation. A month ago, the idea of having dinner with another man would have felt impossible, a betrayal of vows that no longer existed. But now it simply felt like an interesting possibility. "I'd like that," I said. "But I should warn you, I'm still figuring out who I am as a single person. I might not be very good company." "I think you're excellent company, and I'm in no hurry to be anything other than friends." We made plans for the following Friday, and as I walked home, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because a man had asked me to dinner, but because I'd said yes to something that made me happy without considering how it might affect anyone else. The house felt different when I entered it that night, not empty as it had in the first days, after Arthur left, but spacious, full of potential rather than absence. I made myself a cup of tea and opened my life ledger to a new page. Instead of recording financial calculations or future plans, I wrote about the day, the conversation with Mira about our magazine idea, Calder's manuscript, the easy camaraderie of working together in the bookstore. For 40 years, I'd measured my days by how well I'd managed other people's needs and expectations. Now I was learning to measure them by moments of genuine connection, creative satisfaction, and personal growth. It was a completely different kind of accounting, and the balance was entirely in my favor. 2 weeks later, I was in the process of installing new lighting fixtures in the cafe area when Arthur walked into the bookstore. I'd been expecting this visit for days, ever since Lou had mentioned that she'd seen him driving through town. He looked older than when he'd left 6 weeks ago, and tired in a way that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. His new jeans had been replaced by his old corduroy pants, and his hair needed cutting. "The place looks different," he said, surveying the changes I'd made. "It should. I've been renovating." "Where did you get the money for all this?" "From the business account. You know, the one you signed over to me." Arthur walked around the space slowly, taking in the cafe tables, the expanded poetry section, the new lighting. "You've made it very commercial. I've made it profitable. We sold more books last week than we typically sold in a month when you were managing things. Because you've turned it into a coffee shop. Because I've turned it into a community gathering place. People come for the coffee and stay to browse. They attend the poetry readings and buy books by the featured authors. They take writing workshops and purchase the recommended texts. Poetry readings? Every Thursday evening. We've had 3 so far, and each one has drawn bigger crowds." Arthur's expression grew more sour. "I suppose you're reading your own work at these events." "Actually, I am, and people seem to enjoy it." This was true, though it had surprised me as much as anyone. The previous Thursday, when our featured poet had been delayed by car trouble, I'd volunteered to fill the time by reading a few of my own pieces. The response had been enthusiastic enough that several people had asked when I planned to publish a collection. "I came here to discuss practical matters," Arthur said, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. "I need to get some of my books from upstairs. I'm afraid that's not possible. The upstairs is rented now." "Rented? To whom? A young woman who's starting a literary press. She's actually editing a book about local maritime history that I think will do very well. Arthur looked stricken. You rented my office? I rented my office to a paying tenant. It's a much better use of the space than storing your guitar amplifiers. Those aren't just amplifiers, they're valuable equipment. They're in the storage unit I rented for you. The receipt is at the front counter if you want to pick up your things. Arthur moved toward the stairs as if he might go up anyway, then seemed to remember that he no longer had any claim to the space. The reality of his situation appeared to be sinking in fully for the first time. Odette, I think we need to talk. Really talk. About what happened between us. What's to discuss? You decided you needed freedom, and I gave it to you. You're free, and so am I. But maybe we moved too quickly. Maybe we could work things out. Arthur, 6 weeks ago, you told me our marriage felt like a prison. You took our savings and moved in with Gary. What exactly is there to work out? I made a mistake. I was feeling trapped and old, and I panicked. But living apart has made me realize how much I miss what we had together. I studied his face, looking for signs of the genuine remorse that might make this conversation worth having. Instead, I saw desperation and inconvenience. Arthur missed having someone to manage his life, not necessarily having me in it. What you miss is having someone to pay your bills and clean up your messes, I said gently. That's not the same thing as missing me. That's not fair, isn't it? When's the last time you asked me about my dreams, my goals, my interests outside of supporting yours? Arthur was quiet for a long moment. I know I wasn't always the best husband. You weren't a husband at all toward the end. You were a dependent. So that's it? 40 years means nothing to you? 40 years means everything to me. It means I spent 4 decades learning who I am and what I'm capable of. And what I've learned is that I'm capable of much more than I was doing as your wife. At that moment, Mira came down the stairs carrying a stack of manuscripts. She paused when she saw Arthur, clearly sensing the tension in the room. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had a visitor, she said. Mira, this is Arthur, my ex-husband. Arthur, this is Mira Cho, the publisher I was telling you about. Nice to meet you, Mira said politely, though she looked ready to retreat upstairs if necessary. So you're the one who took over my office, Arthur said. I'm renting the upstairs space, yes. It's perfect for what I need. And what exactly do you need it for? There was an edge to Arthur's voice that I recognized, the slightly condescending tone he used when he felt threatened by someone else's success. I'm starting a literary press focused on poetry and experimental fiction, Mira said with admirable composure. I'm also collaborating with Odette on a quarterly literary magazine. Arthur's gaze snapped back to me. You're starting a magazine? We're starting a magazine, I corrected. It's something I've wanted to do for 30 years. Since when? Since graduate school. You know, back when I had ambitions beyond supporting yours. Mira excused herself and went back upstairs, leaving Arthur and me alone again. He sat down heavily in one of the cafe chairs, suddenly looking every one of his 69 years. I don't understand what's happened to you, he said. This isn't the woman I married. You're absolutely right. The woman you married was 27, years old and didn't know any better. I'm 67 now, and I do. So there's no chance we could try again? Start fresh? Arthur, what would be different? Would you suddenly become financially responsible? Would you start contributing equally to domestic labor? Would you take an interest in my goals and dreams? I could try. You've had 40 years to try. Why would you start now? because I'm alone and scared, and I don't know how to take care of myself. Finally, the truth. Arthur wasn't missing our marriage. He was missing having a caretaker. "I'm sorry you're scared," I said, and I meant it. "But I can't fix that for you anymore. You're going to have to learn to take care of yourself, the way I learned to take care of myself. How am I supposed to do that? I don't know how to manage money or cook decent meals or keep a house clean. The same way every other adult learns. Practice, trial and error, and accepting responsibility for your own life." Arthur sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the floor. When he looked up, his eyes were wet with tears. "I'm sorry, Odette. I know I hurt you, and I know it's too late to fix it, but I want you to know that I'm sorry." For the first time since he'd left, I felt a flicker of genuine sympathy for him. "I appreciate that, Arthur. And I'm sorry, too, for all the years we both spent pretending our marriage was working, when it wasn't. Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" "I already have. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means I'm not carrying anger around anymore." Arthur nodded slowly, then stood up and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. "For what it's worth, the place does look good. You've done something special here. Thank you." After he left, I sat alone in the cafe area, processing the conversation. I'd expected to feel triumphant or vindicated, but instead I felt oddly peaceful. Arthur's apology hadn't changed anything practical, but it had provided a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. Mira appeared at the bottom of the stairs, carrying 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, handing me one of the cups. "You're very perceptive. How are you feeling?" "Relieved, I think. For weeks I've been wondering if I'd made the right choice, if I'd been too harsh or unforgiving. But seeing him today confirmed that we made the right decision." "He seemed to want you back. He wanted his caretaker back. There's a difference." Mira settled into the chair across from me. "Can I tell you something? Watching you rebuild your life has been inspiring. When I moved here, I was terrified that I was making a huge mistake, giving up a stable job to chase an impractical dream. But seeing how you've transformed yourself and this place has given me confidence that taking risks can pay off. Even when you're 67? Especially when you're 67. You have nothing left to lose and everything to gain." That evening, I had dinner with Calder at a small restaurant overlooking the harbor. We'd been meeting for coffee or meals regularly over the past few weeks, developing the kind of easy friendship I hadn't experienced since college. "You look thoughtful tonight," he observed over our appetizers. I told him about Arthur's visit and the strange mix of emotions it had stirred up. "Do you think you'll miss being married?" Calder asked. "I'll miss the idea of being married, the companionship, the shared history, the sense of building something together. But I won't miss the reality of my marriage, which was mostly me adapting myself to Arthur's needs. I understand that feeling. After Margaret died, I realized how much of my identity had been tied up in being her husband. I had to rediscover who I was as just myself." "What did you discover?" "That I'm more social than I thought. That I enjoy cooking for one as much as cooking for two. That I have interests Margaret didn't share, and that's okay." "Such as?" "Bird watching. She thought it was boring, so I never pursued it seriously. Now I spend weekend mornings at the nature preserve with my binoculars, and it brings me tremendous peace. What else? I like dancing. Margaret had no rhythm and felt self-conscious about it, so we never danced except at weddings. Now I go to the community center's senior dance nights, and I'm actually pretty good at it. The idea of Calder dancing made me smile. Would you teach me sometime? I'd love to. Do you like music? I love music. Arthur was a musician, but he was very possessive about it. He had strong opinions about what was good and what was commercial trash. And I learned to keep my preferences to myself. What do you like that he would have considered trash? ABBA, Dolly Parton, Motown. Songs that make you want to move your body and sing along. Excellent dance music, Calder said approvingly. We should definitely plan a dancing lesson. As we walked back to our cars after dinner, Calder took my hand. It was a simple gesture, friendly, rather than romantic, but it sent a shock of recognition through me. I couldn't remember the last time Arthur had held my hand without an agenda, without wanting something from me. Thank you for dinner, I said, and for listening. Thank you for trusting me with your story. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the difference between Arthur's version of companionship and what I was beginning to experience with Calder. Arthur had needed me to be smaller, so he could feel larger. Calder seemed to enjoy my full size, my opinions, my complexity. It was a revelation that would have felt dangerous a few months ago. Now it felt like coming home to myself. The first issue of Harbour Light, our quarterly literary magazine, came out in early December, featuring poetry and fiction by 12 writers from across New England. Mira and I had worked for 6 weeks to pull it together, designing layouts, editing submissions, and coordinating with our printer in Portland. The launch party was held in the bookstore on a Friday evening, with readings by several of the featured authors and a reception catered by the local bakery. I'd expected maybe 30 people to attend, but by 7 o'clock the store was packed with nearly 60 guests, including several writers who'd driven from as far away as Boston to support our venture. This is incredible, Mira whispered to me as we surveyed the crowd. I think we might actually make this work. I was scheduled to read last, sharing 3 poems I'd written about divorce and renewal. As I stood at the makeshift podium we'd set up near the front window, looking out at the faces of friends, neighbors, and fellow writers, I felt a confidence I hadn't experienced since my teaching days. The first poem was about Arthur's departure, titled Freedom. He said he needed freedom as if our marriage had been a cage I'd built around him, with locks only I could open. But when he walked away, I realized I'd been the one behind bars all along, and he'd simply been my longtime guard. Now I wake each morning to the sound of doors unlocking themselves, windows opening wide to let in light I'd forgotten existed. This is what freedom feels like, not the absence of love, but the presence of choice. The applause was warm and sustained, encouraging me to continue with poems about rediscovering creativity, building new friendships, and learning to live at full volume after decades of careful quiet. When I finished reading, Lou appeared at my side with tears in her eyes. Honey, I had no idea you were such a poet. Those pieces were beautiful. Thank you. It feels good to share them. Calder approached with a glass of wine for me and a proud smile. Those were powerful poems, Odette. You should think about submitting them to some of the national magazines. Do you really think they're good enough? I think they're exactly what people need to hear. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself surrounded by people offering congratulations, asking about future issues, and expressing interest in attending our upcoming writing workshops. The bookstore had never felt more alive, more connected to its community. Mira and I stayed late to clean up, stacking chairs and washing wine glasses while reviewing the evening's successes. I can't believe we pulled this off, she said. 6 months ago, I was working for someone else's magazine, and living in my parents' basement. Now I'm co-editing my own publication and living in a beautiful Maine town. 6 months ago, I was married to a man who took me for granted and running a failing bookstore. Now I'm a published poet and a magazine editor. What changed for you? I mean, what made you finally stand up for yourself? I considered the question while wiping down the last of the cafe tables. I think Arthur leaving forced me to see how much of myself I'd given away over the years. And once I started taking pieces back, I realized how much more there was to reclaim. Do you think you would have found this version of yourself if he hadn't left? Honestly, probably not. I was too comfortable being small, too afraid of rocking the boat. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show you what you're actually capable of. The next morning, I woke to find a review of our magazine launch in the Portland Press-Herald's art section. The writer, whom I recognized as one of the poets who'd attended our event, had written, "Harbor Light represents exactly the kind of grassroots literary initiative that small communities need to thrive culturally. Editor Odette has created more than just a magazine. She's fostered a genuine literary community in Dorset Hollow. The quality of writing in this first issue is exceptional, and Albridge's own poetry about reinvention and self-discovery provides the perfect anchor for a publication that clearly believes in the power of authentic voices." I read the review 3 times, hardly believing that the woman being praised was the same person who had been afraid to share her writing just 6 months earlier. My phone rang while I was still processing the review. It was Rhea, calling from Chicago. "Mom, I just read the most amazing thing online. Did you know there's a review of your magazine in the Portland Press-Herald? I just saw it this morning." "Mom, they called you an editor and praised your poetry. Do you understand how incredible this is?" "I'm starting to. I'm so proud of you. Dad called me yesterday asking if I thought you'd consider reconciliation, and I told him he was crazy. You're becoming the person you were always meant to be." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with my morning coffee and the newspaper spread before me, feeling something I'd never experienced before. Pride in my own accomplishments. Not pride in supporting someone else's dreams or managing other people's needs, but genuine satisfaction in work I'd created myself. At 67 years old, I was finally learning what it felt like to live at the center of my own life. But the real test of my transformation was yet to come. 3 days before Christmas, I received a call from an unknown number in Portland. The voice on the other end identified herself as Jennifer Walsh, an editor at a regional publishing house that specialized in poetry and memoir. "Ms. Albridge, I attended your magazine launch last week and was impressed by the poems you read. I'm wondering if you might be interested in discussing a poetry collection with us." I nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" "We publish 3 or 4 poetry collections each year by established and emerging voices. Your work has the kind of authenticity and emotional resonance we look for. Would you be interested in putting together a full-length manuscript?" Yes, I think I would be very interested." "Wonderful. Could you send me 20 to 25 of your strongest poems? If we like what we see, we'd love to schedule a meeting to discuss a potential contract." After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. A real publisher wanted to see my work, not Arthur's work, not something I'd helped him edit or promote, but poems I'd written from my own experience and perspective. I called Mira immediately to share the news. "Odette, that's incredible. Jennifer Walsh has an excellent reputation. Her authors win awards and get reviewed in national publications. I'm terrified," I admitted. "What if my poems aren't good enough? What if I've been deluding myself about their quality? What if they're better than you think? What if this is exactly what's supposed to happen next? I spent the next week assembling my strongest poems into a cohesive collection, organizing them thematically around the journey from marriage through divorce to self-discovery. The manuscript told the story of my transformation, but in a way that felt universal rather than simply personal. When I sent the poems to Jennifer Walsh, I included a cover letter that began, "These poems chronicle a year of radical change in my life, from the end of a 40-year marriage to the discovery of creative and personal freedom I'd never imagined possible." The response came faster than I'd expected. Jennifer called within a week to offer me a publishing contract. "Your poems are exactly what we're looking for," she said. "They're honest, well-crafted, and they speak to experiences that many women will recognize. We'd like to publish your collection next fall." I signed the contract on New Year's Eve, sitting at my kitchen table with Mira, Calder, and Lou as witnesses. The book would be titled Reclamation, and it would be my first published work at age 68. "To Odette," Calder said, raising his glass of champagne, "who proved that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." "To second chances," Lou added. "To the courage to take up space," Mira contributed. I looked around at these people who'd become my chosen family, who'd supported my transformation without trying to diminish it or control it, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "To finding out that freedom isn't something you take," I said. "It's something you create." As the clock struck midnight, and we welcomed 2025, I thought about Arthur and wondered if he'd found what he was looking for. I hoped he had. Not because I wanted him back, but because I wanted him to discover the same truth I'd learned. That happiness comes not from escaping responsibility, but from taking responsibility for your own joy. The fog was rolling in from the harbor, wrapping around the streetlights like gauze, just as it had the night Arthur left. But this time, I wasn't. Sitting alone with a ledger of grievances and unpaid debts, I was surrounded by people who valued my full self, celebrating work I'd created with my own hands and imagination. 6 months earlier, I'd been calculating the cost of a failed marriage. Now I was measuring the value of a reclaimed life, and the numbers were entirely in my favor. The difference between those two calculations was the difference between survival and transformation. It was the difference between living small and living out loud. At 67, I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all, that the best revenge isn't getting even with the people who've wronged you. The best revenge is becoming so fully yourself that their absence feels like a gift. Spring arrived early in Dorset Hollow, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to match my own transformation. The bookstore was thriving beyond my most optimistic projections, with the cafe area filled most mornings with locals meeting for coffee, and the evening poetry readings drawing audiences from as far away as Portland. Mira's literary press had published its first book, Calder's Maritime History, which had received excellent reviews in regional publications and was selling steadily in local bookstores. She was already working on her second title, a collection of experimental poetry by a young writer from Vermont. My own book wouldn't be released until October, but the anticipation was building. Jennifer Walsh had scheduled readings at bookstores throughout New England, and several literary magazines had requested poems from the collection for advance publication. But the most significant change in my life wasn't professional. It was personal. Calder and I had been spending more and more time together, sharing meals, attending cultural events, and taking long walks along the harbor. Our friendship had deepened into something more romantic, though we'd approached it with the deliberate care of people who'd learned not to rush into emotional commitments. "I have a confession," he said one evening, as we sat on my front porch watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and crimson. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The declaration should have terrified me. 6 months earlier it would have. But I'd learned so much about myself in the intervening months that I felt confident in my ability to navigate a relationship as an equal partner rather than a junior member. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," I replied. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not the same woman I was when I was married. I won't compromise my dreams or make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's needs. I wouldn't want you to. I fell in love with the woman who started a magazine, published poetry, and transformed a failing bookstore into a community hub. Why would I want you to be anyone other than exactly who you are? Because that's what I did for 40 years. I made myself into whatever Arthur needed me to be." "I'm not Arthur," Calder said gently. "I don't need you to be anything other than yourself." A month later, Arthur appeared at the bookstore again, but this time his visit felt less like an intrusion and more like a final chapter closing. He looked healthier than he had in our previous encounters, and he was carrying a guitar case. "I wanted you to know that I'm leaving Dorset Hollow," he said. "Gary and I are driving cross-country. We're going to try to make it as musicians in Nashville." The plan was so quintessentially Arthur, so optimistic and impractical, that I almost smiled. 2 men in their late 60s setting off to become country music stars. It was the kind of romantic gesture that had charmed me 45 years ago and exhausted me for the 40 years since. "I hope it works out for you," I said, and meant it. "Before I go, I wanted to give you something." He opened his guitar case and pulled out a leather journal I recognized. It was the notebook where he'd been writing song lyrics for the past decade, the repository of all his musical ambitions and creative frustrations. "I want you to have this. There are some poems in here that I never turned into songs. I thought maybe you could use them, or transform them, or just understand them in a way I never could." I accepted the journal, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Arthur. That's very generous." I also wanted to apologize again. Not for leaving, because I think we both know that was the right thing to do, but for staying so long when I was making us both unhappy, and for taking so much without giving back. Apology accepted. "Are you happy, Odette? Really happy?" I considered the question seriously. "Yes, I am. I'm happier than I've been in decades." "Good. You deserve that." After he left, I sat in the empty bookstore reading through his journal. His lyrics were better than I'd expected, filled with genuine emotion and poetic imagery. But they were also distinctly his, concerned with freedom and escape, rather than connection and growth. That evening, I shared the journal with Calder over dinner. "It's interesting," he said after reading several pages. "His writing is all about running towards something he can't define. Your poetry is about arriving somewhere specific." "What do you mean?" "His poems are about the desire for change. Yours are about the experience of actually changing." The observation struck me as profound. Arthur had spent our entire marriage dreaming of transformation while resisting the work it required. I'd spent the past year actually doing the work of becoming someone new. The difference explained everything about why our marriage had failed and why my new life was succeeding. In June, Maisie visited with unexpected news. She was pregnant with her second child, and she'd finally confronted David about his pattern of making unilateral decisions. I told him that if he wanted to move to Burlington, he could go ahead, she said as we walked through my garden, where the roses were in full bloom. But Finn and I would stay in Montpellier until he learned to include us in major life choices. How? Did he respond? He was shocked. He genuinely hadn't realized how often he made decisions without consulting me. But instead of getting defensive, he asked me to help him understand what I needed from him. That's promising. It is. We're in couples therapy now, learning to communicate better, and watching you rebuild your life gave me the courage to ask for what I wanted instead of just adapting to what he decided. What about Burlington? We're staying in Montpellier. He realized that the job offer wasn't worth disrupting our family if I wasn't enthusiastic about it. As we sat on the porch later, watching Finn play in the garden, Maisie asked me about Calder. Are you planning to marry him? I honestly don't know. We've talked about moving in together, but marriage feels like something from my old life. I'm not sure I need that kind of legal commitment anymore. But you love him. I do, but it's a completely different kind of love than what I had with your father. With Arthur, I loved him by making myself smaller. With Calder, I love him by being exactly who I am. That sounds much healthier. It feels healthier. But it's also scarier because I can't control the outcome by managing his needs. I have to trust that he loves me for myself, not for what I can do for him. Rhea visited in August, bringing her teenage daughter Emma to spend a week in Dorset Hollow. Emma was 16 and interested in creative writing, and she spent hours in the bookstore, cafe working on short stories and poems. I want to be like Grandma when I grow up, she announced one evening over dinner. Starting over at 67 and becoming a published poet. That's so badass. Rhea laughed. I never thought I'd hear my daughter use my mother as an example. Of rebellion. It's not rebellion, I corrected. It's evolution. What's the difference? Emma asked. Rebellion is about rejecting what came before. Evolution is about becoming what you were always meant to be. So you were always meant to be a poet. I was always meant to be myself. The poetry is just one expression of that. Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Rhea and I sat on the porch with glasses of wine, enjoying the kind of mother-daughter conversation we'd never quite managed when she was younger. Can I tell you something? Rhea said. Growing up, I always worried that you were too accommodating, too willing to sacrifice your own needs for everyone else's. I was afraid I'd inherited that pattern. Have you? Not the way I feared. Watching you transform has taught me that there's a difference between being generous and being a doormat. You're still generous, but now you're generous from a position of strength rather than weakness. I'm still learning that distinction myself. What's the most important thing you've learned this year? I thought about the question while watching the fog roll in from the harbor. That taking up space isn't selfish, that my dreams matter as much as anyone else's, and that love shouldn't require you to become smaller. Those are good lessons for Emma to learn now, rather than having to figure them out at 67. They're good lessons for anyone to learn at any age. The book launch party for Reclamation was held in October at the bookstore, exactly 1 year after Arthur had left. The event drew nearly 100 people, including several writers from the national literary scene who'd heard about the collection through reviews and word of mouth. I read the title poem, which had become the centerpiece of the collection. They say you can't reclaim what was never really yours, but I am living proof that some things become yours only in the taking back. My voice buried beneath 40 years of careful quiet. My dreams, deferred so long I'd forgotten their original shape. My laughter, authentic and unafraid to take up space. I am reclaiming the woman I was before I learned to make myself smaller. The girl who believed her thoughts were worth sharing, her words worth preserving. At 67, I am finally meeting myself for the first time, and she is magnificent. The applause was sustained and emotional, with several people wiping away tears. After the reading, I signed books for nearly an hour, many for people who shared their own stories of late-life transformation. One woman, perhaps my age, approached the signing table with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said simply. "I've been married for 43 years to a man who treats me like an employee. Your book has given me permission to imagine a different kind of life." "The permission was always yours," I replied. "Sometimes we just need to see someone else. Claim it first." As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, I found myself standing in the bookstore with Calder, Mira, and Lou, surrounded by the evidence of my transformed life. A year ago tonight, I was sitting in my kitchen calculating what Arthur owed me, I said. Now I'm here celebrating my first published book. "What changed?" Lou asked. "I stopped measuring my worth by what other people took from me, and started measuring it by what I could create for myself." "And?" Calder prompted. "And I discovered that I'm worth much more than I ever imagined." Later that night, as Calder and I cleaned up after the party, he brought up a conversation we'd been having for months. "I know you have reservations about marriage," he said, "but I'd like to make a formal commitment to you. Not because I think you need protection or support, but because I want to publicly declare that I choose you every day, exactly as you are." I considered his proposal while we stacked chairs and wiped down tables. The idea of marriage no longer frightened me the way it had even 6 months earlier. I'd proven to myself that I could maintain my independence and identity within a partnership, as long as it was the right partnership with the right person. "What would this marriage look like?" I asked. "Two whole people choosing to share their lives while maintaining their individual dreams and goals. No one making themselves smaller, no one giving up their voice. Can you handle being married to a woman who refuses to be managed or controlled? Can you handle being married to a man who will encourage you to take up even more space than you already do?" I think I'd like to find out. We were married the following spring in my garden, surrounded by the roses I'd planted and tended for 20 years. Mira served as my matron of honor, and Lou officiated with a license she'd obtained online, specifically for the occasion. The ceremony was small and simple, focused not on promises to change or complete each other, but on vows to support each other's continued growth and evolution. "I promise to love you not despite your ambitions, but because of them," I said in my vows. "I promise to take up my full space and encourage you to do the same. I promise to celebrate your successes without needing them to be smaller than mine," Calder replied. "I promise to build a partnership based on addition, not subtraction." Arthur didn't attend the wedding, but he sent a card from Nashville with a note that read, "Congratulations on finding the happiness you always deserved. Thank you for setting us both free." 2 years later, I was invited to give the keynote address at a conference on women's creativity after 50. Standing at the podium looking out at an audience of 300 women, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. "For 40 years I kept receipts," I began. "Not just financial receipts, but emotional ones. Evidence of everything I'd given up, every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred in service of someone else's vision. When my marriage ended, I used those receipts to reclaim what was rightfully mine. But the most important thing I reclaimed Wasn't money or property or even my business. It was my right to take up space in my own life. The lesson I want to share with you today is this. You don't need anyone's permission to become who you were meant to be. You don't need to wait for someone else to leave before you can claim your full space. And you're never too old to start over. Because starting over isn't about abandoning what came before. It's about integrating everything you've learned into a version of yourself that refuses to be diminished. At 69, I'm published. I'm in love. And I'm living at the center of my own life. Not because someone gave me permission, but because I finally gave it to myself. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. Afterward, dozens of women approached me with their own stories of transformation, of reclamation, of learning to live out loud after decades of careful quiet. Driving home to Dorset Hollow that evening, I thought about the woman I had been 3 years earlier, sitting in her kitchen calculating debts and grievances. She couldn't have imagined this life, this confidence, this joy. But she'd had the courage to take the first step, to stop making herself smaller and start claiming what was rightfully hers. Everything else had followed from that single act of reclamation. As I pulled into my driveway, I could see Calder waiting on the front porch with a glass of wine and a smile. The bookstore was dark, but full of promise for tomorrow's customers. The garden was bursting with late spring flowers I'd planted and tended myself. This life I'd built was entirely my own creation, funded not by what others owed me, but by what I'd been willing to invest in myself. The accounting was finally balanced, and the numbers were beautiful. 5 years after Arthur walked out of our kitchen that foggy October morning, I found myself standing in the same spot, but everything else had changed beyond recognition. The ceramic bowl where I'd dropped his wedding ring now held fresh herbs from my garden. Basil, rosemary, and thyme that I used for cooking meals I actually enjoyed eating. The kitchen itself had been renovated with warm yellow walls that Arthur would have hated, and a farmhouse sink I'd wanted for 20 years, but never requested. Through the window I could see the coastal bookshelf, bustling with its usual morning crowd. What had once been a struggling bookstore limping along on Arthur's romantic vision was now the cultural heart of Dorset Hollow, featured in travel magazines as a must-visit destination for literary tourists exploring coastal Maine. The cafe served locally roasted coffee and pastries made by Emma, Ria's daughter, who'd graduated from culinary school and convinced me to let her expand our food offerings into a full breakfast and lunch menu. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Like most meaningful changes, it had required patience, persistence, and a willingness to keep adjusting course when the original plan proved insufficient. There had been setbacks. The winter when frozen pipes flooded the store, the month when our main supplier went out of business, the week when I questioned every decision I'd made since Arthur left. But each challenge had taught me something about resilience, about the difference between responding and reacting, about the quiet strength that comes from knowing you can handle whatever comes next. Mira's literary press, Harbor Light Publishing, had grown from a one-woman operation in my upstairs office to a respected small press with national distribution. She'd published 17 books in 5 years, including 3 that had won regional literary awards and 1 poetry collection that had been nominated for a National Book Award. Her success had attracted other creative professionals to Dorset Hollow, a freelance editor who specialized in memoirs, a book designer who worked with publishers throughout New England, a literary agent who'd grown tired of New York City's pace and discovered she could represent clients just as effectively from a small coastal town. The gentrification concerned some longtime residents, but we'd been careful to ensure that growth enhanced rather than displaced the existing community. The bookstore's success had helped other local businesses thrive, and we'd established a fund that provided affordable housing for young families and seniors on fixed incomes. Lou, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, served on the town planning board and made sure development remained sustainable and inclusive. My own life had evolved in ways I couldn't have imagined when I first opened that life ledger and began calculating what Arthur owed me. Reclamation had been reprinted 3 times and translated into French and German. I'd published 2 more poetry collections, Afterwards and Full Circle, both exploring themes of renewal, creative fulfillment, and the particular joy of living authentically in the second half of life. My readings now took me to universities and literary festivals across the country, where I spoke to audiences hungry for stories about transformation that began not in youth, but in the decades society often dismisses as decline. The marriage to Calder had deepened into something richer than I'd known was possible. We'd built a partnership based on addition rather than subtraction, 2 whole people choosing daily to support each other's growth, rather than demand accommodation of each other's limitations. He'd published his maritime history with a university press and was working on a second book about women who'd run businesses in coastal Maine during the 19th century. A project inspired, he claimed, by watching me transform the bookstore. We maintained separate bedrooms by choice, each needing space that was entirely our own. But we cooked together most evenings and had developed rituals that honored both solitude and connection. Sunday mornings were for reading in companionable silence. Wednesday evenings were reserved for whatever cultural event caught our fancy. Theater in Portland, concerts at the community college, or simply walking the harbor and talking about books we'd discovered. Fridays belonged to friends, hosting dinners or attending gatherings that fed our need for broader community. The arrangement worked because neither of us expected the other to be everything. Calder couldn't replace the friendship I'd built with Lou, or the creative partnership I shared with Mira, or the maternal satisfaction I found in watching my daughters navigate their own growth. And I couldn't replace his weekly bird-watching group, or his volunteer work at the Maritime Museum, or his Thursday evening poker game with retired professors. We enhanced each other's lives without trying to complete them. Arthur had never returned to Dorset Hollow after his wedding appearance, but we exchanged Christmas cards each year with brief updates. He and Gary had spent 2 years in Nashville, without achieving musical stardom, then settled in Asheville, North Carolina, where Arthur taught guitar lessons and performed at coffee shops. His cards suggested contentment, if not happiness, a kind of peace with being a small fish in a small pond after decades of chasing dreams, too large for his actual talents or commitment level. I felt no bitterness toward him anymore, no need to rehearse old grievances or imagine different outcomes. Arthur had given me an inadvertent gift by leaving, the crisis that forced me to discover my own strength. Without his departure, I might have continued accommodating, diminishing, deferring, until death made the question of personal fulfillment moot. Instead, I'd learned that 67 was not too late to start over, that reinvention was possible at any age if you were willing to do the work. The work hadn't been easy. Therapy had helped me understand the patterns I'd developed in childhood that made self-sacrifice feel like love, the ways I'd confused being needed with being valued. Dr. Hennigan had retired, but I'd continued with a younger therapist who specialized in late-life transitions. Together, we'd explored the difference between healthy generosity and destructive self-abnegation, between supporting others' dreams and abandoning your own. I'd also had to learn practical skills Arthur had always handled: basic car maintenance, financial planning beyond monthly budgeting, home repairs more complex than changing light bulbs. Lou had been invaluable in this education, introducing me to her mechanic, her financial advisor, her handyman, and teaching me which tasks were worth learning to do myself versus which were worth paying professionals to handle. The financial independence had been crucial to my transformation. For 40 years, I'd never had money that was entirely mine, never made a major purchase without consultation or justification, learning to manage the bookstore's finances, to make investment decisions to spend money on things I wanted rather than things others needed, had been both liberating and terrifying. The first time I'd bought an expensive piece of art simply because it moved me, I'd felt guilty for weeks. Now I understood that the guilt had been programmed by decades of being taught that my desires were less important than everyone else's needs. Rhea and Maisie had both married partners who encouraged their growth rather than demanding their accommodation, a change I like to think my example had influenced. Rhea had made partner at her architectural firm and was designing affordable housing projects throughout the Midwest. Maisie had returned to painting seriously after years of calling it a hobby, and her work was now displayed in galleries throughout Vermont and New Hampshire. Both daughters visited regularly, bringing their children to spend weeks each summer in Dorset Hollow, where they learned to love books and ocean air and the particular satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful with your own. Emma, now 21, had become my unofficial successor in many ways. She'd started working at the bookstore during high school visits and continued through college, learning every aspect of the business from inventory management to event planning. Her culinary skills had elevated our cafe from a simple coffee service to a destination restaurant that drew food lovers from throughout the region. More importantly, she'd absorbed the lesson that work could be personally fulfilling rather than just financially necessary. That building something you cared about was worth more than simply collecting a paycheck. "Grandma," she'd said during her last visit, "I want to do what you did. Not exactly the same thing, but I want to create something that matters to me, something that makes the community better." "What does that look like for you?" "I'm thinking about culinary school, but not to work in someone else's restaurant. I want to start a business that teaches cooking skills to people who've never learned, especially older adults who've been dependent on others for meal preparation, like a culinary empowerment program." The idea was brilliant and completely Emma, practical, compassionate, and focused on helping people develop independence rather than increasing their dependence. I'd offered to help her write a business plan and identify potential funding sources, thrilled to support someone else's vision without being expected to sacrifice my own goals in the process. The literary magazine had evolved beyond our original vision, becoming a quarterly publication with national distribution and a reputation for discovering new voices. Mira and I had been joined by a rotating editorial board that included writers, teachers, and community members, ensuring that our perspective remained fresh and inclusive. We'd also started an annual writing retreat that brought established and emerging writers to Dorset Hollow for a week of workshops, readings, and collaborative projects. The retreat had become one of my favorite weeks each year, the bookstore and cafe buzzing with creative energy as writers worked on new projects and shared work in progress. Watching other people discover their voices, claim their space, pursue their dreams with the support of a literary community reminded me why I'd started this work in the first place. We weren't just publishing books or selling coffee. We were creating conditions that allowed people to become more fully themselves. My own writing had continued to evolve, moving beyond the personal transformation themes of my early collections. toward broader explorations of aging, creativity, and community in contemporary America. The poems were more complex now, less obviously autobiographical, but no less authentic. Critics had noted the development, praising my ability to transform personal experience into universal insight without losing the specific details that made the work compelling. I was currently working on a prose memoir about the first 5 years after my divorce, exploring not just the dramatic changes but the daily practices that had sustained transformation. The book would include practical advice about late-life reinvention, but grounded in story rather than self-help platitudes. Several agents had expressed interest based on the proposal, and I was taking my time to find the right match, someone who understood that this wasn't just another divorce memoir, but a book about the possibility of radical change at any age. The memoir project had required me to revisit my life ledger, that leather-bound journal where I'd first begun calculating what Arthur owed me. Reading those early entries now, I was struck by how much anger they contained, how focused I'd been on documenting injury rather than imagining possibility. The anger had been necessary, providing the energy I'd needed to make difficult changes. But I was grateful to have moved beyond it into something more generative. I still kept a journal, but its purpose had shifted completely. Instead of recording grievances, I documented daily gratitudes, creative insights, and goals for continued growth. The current volume was filled with observations about light on water, conversations with interesting customers, ideas for new poems, and plans for travel I wanted to undertake. The focus had shifted from what I'd lost to what I was gaining, from what others owed me to what I owed myself. The biggest change, perhaps, was learning to live in the present rather than constantly referencing the past or worrying about the future. For decades, I'd been either regretting previous choices or anxious about upcoming challenges. Arthur's departure had forced me into the immediacy of crisis management, and somewhere in that process, I discovered the particular peace that comes from focusing on what you can actually control right now. This morning was a perfect example. Instead of worrying about whether the memoir would find the right publisher, or whether Emma would successfully launch her culinary business, or whether my 72nd birthday next month meant I should be scaling back rather than taking on new projects, I was simply enjoying the ritual of making coffee in my sunny kitchen while planning the day ahead. Lou was coming for lunch, bringing her latest volunteer project, helping elderly residents navigate social services applications. Mira and I had a 2:00 meeting with a poet whose manuscript we were considering for publication. Calder and I were attending the community college's production of Our Town that evening, followed by drinks with the theater director and her wife, friends we'd made through our shared appreciation for live performance. It was an ordinary day filled with meaningful work, genuine relationships, and activities that reflected my actual interests, rather than obligations I'd accepted out of habit or guilt. The simplicity was revolutionary, after decades of scheduling my life around other people's needs and preferences. At 11:00, I walked down to the bookstore to check on Emma's lunch preparations and review the weekend's event. Schedule. We were hosting a reading by a novelist whose latest book explored themes of female friendship after 50, followed by our monthly community book club discussion of Educated by Tara Westover. Sunday afternoon would feature a workshop on Grant, writing for artists, led by a woman who'd successfully funded her transition from corporate marketing to documentary filmmaking at age 58. The events weren't randomly chosen. Everything we hosted was designed to support people in becoming more fully themselves, whether through creative expression, intellectual exploration, or practical skill development. The bookstore had become more than a business. It was a community resource for anyone interested in growth, change, or simply connecting with others who shared their curiosity about the world. "Morning, Grandma." Emma called from the cafe kitchen, where she was preparing her signature quiche recipe, a combination of local vegetables, Maine cheese, and herbs from my garden. The novelist called to confirm her reading time, and I've already sold 12 copies of her book to people who want to read it before tomorrow night. "Excellent. How's the quiche coming along?" "Perfect. I'm also making that soup you like, the one with white beans and kale. Should be ready by noon." Emma had inherited my attention to detail, along with Calder's easy confidence and Mira's entrepreneurial instincts. Watching her navigate challenges with grace and creativity reminded me that influence extends far beyond biological relationships. The young woman I'd helped shape through example and encouragement was now capable of independent success, but she'd chosen to build it in partnership with people who supported her growth. The thought led me to reflect on legacy, a concept that had taken on new meaning since my transformation began. For 40 years, I'd assumed my legacy would be the children I'd raised and the husband I'd supported, my contributions measured by how well I'd enabled others to succeed. Now I understood that legacy could be more direct and personal. The books I'd written, the business I'd built, the community I'd helped strengthen, the example I'd provided for other women seeking late-life transformation. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest, proof that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. The afternoon meeting with the poet went well. Her manuscript, After the Last Child Leaves, explored the particular freedom and disorientation that comes when the primary job of your adult life suddenly ends. The poems were raw and honest about the grief involved in successful parenting, raising children who no longer need you, while celebrating the opportunity to rediscover yourself beyond the maternal role. "Your work reminds me of my early poems," I told her as we finished reviewing her manuscript. The urgency of someone discovering their voice after years of using it primarily in service of others. That's exactly what happened to me. I stopped writing when my kids were little because I didn't have time or energy. When my youngest left for college last fall, I suddenly had both, but I'd forgotten how to access my creativity. "How did you find your way back?" "I read your first collection, actually. Reclamation made me realize that reclaiming your creativity isn't selfish. It's necessary. Your poems gave me permission to take my own writing seriously again." These conversations happened regularly now, women telling me that my example had encouraged their own transformations. The responsibility felt both humbling and energizing. By living authentically, I'd apparently created space for others to do the same. Mira and I decided to publish the poet's manuscript as our spring release, pairing it with a reading series about creativity after major life transitions. We were already booking authors whose work explored reinvention, artistic development, and the particular challenges faced by women seeking creative fulfillment in their later decades. The evening performance of Our Town was particularly moving, perhaps because I now understood viscerally what Emily means when she returns from death to observe a single ordinary day and realizes that living people don't appreciate the beauty of simple moments. For 40 years, I'd been too busy managing everyone else's needs to fully inhabit my own experience. Now I tried to notice everything. The way late afternoon light fell across the bookstore's wooden floors, the satisfaction of a conversation that left both participants feeling heard, the pleasure of preparing a meal for people I genuinely enjoyed feeding. After the play, Calder and I joined the theater director and her wife at a wine bar that had opened recently in a renovated ship captain's house. The conversation ranged from local arts funding to national politics to personal stories about career, changes, and relationship evolution. I found myself talking about the memoir project and discovering new insights through the act of articulation. The most surprising thing about starting over at 67, I heard myself saying, was learning that I'd been living in black and white for decades without realizing it. Everything felt muted, careful, constrained. I thought that was maturity, but it was actually a form of self-suppression. "What changed that?" asked the theater director. "Crisis, initially. Arthur leaving forced me to make decisions based on what I actually wanted, rather than what would keep everyone else comfortable. But then I had to learn to trust my own judgment, to believe that my preferences were as valid as anyone else's." Do you think it required that level of crisis? Could someone make those changes without having their life fall apart first? I hope so. I think the key is recognizing that accommodation isn't love, that making yourself smaller doesn't actually make anyone else bigger, and that taking up your full space in the world is a gift to everyone around you, not an act of selfishness. The conversation continued until nearly midnight, the kind of wide-ranging discussion that feeds the soul and reminds you why human connection matters. Driving home through Dorset Hollow's quiet streets, I felt grateful for this life I'd built, for the friends who valued my full self, for the work that engaged my creativity and intellect. As I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been 5 years ago, sitting in her kitchen calculating financial debts and emotional grievances. She'd been right to demand what was owed to her, but she'd been thinking too small. The real debt wasn't what Arthur owed me for 40 years of marriage. It was what I owed myself for 40 years of self-neglect. I'd spent the last 5 years paying that debt through daily choices to prioritize my own growth, to pursue work that mattered to me, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than need fulfillment. The balance was finally in my favor, not because I'd extracted payment from someone else, but because I'd learned to invest properly in myself. Standing at my bedroom window, looking out at the harbor where fog was beginning to roll in, I thought about tomorrow's possibilities. There were poems to write, books to edit, events to plan, friends to see, conversations to have, meals to cook, gardens to tend. An ordinary life made extraordinary by the simple act of living it fully, without apology or diminishment. At 71, I was finally becoming the woman I'd been meant to be all along. The accounting was complete, and every number was beautiful. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.